No. Let me carry on. I had the opportunity, let me just describe it a little bit in my own words, although, of course, their words are so much more powerful. We had the opportunity in Jerusalem to meet the representatives, very, very young teenagers, people in their early 20s, of about 3 or 4 or 5 families, many of whom had still lost many of their relatives. And they pointed at me and they said, "You are also responsible to do something about this, to try to find those people we have lost, to try to find if those people that we've lost are still alive, and to try to find ways of bringing them back. You are also responsible." And I sat there thinking whether this was the time for me to describe the OCHA mandate or not, ludicrously. Of course I didn't. And we talked about the work of courageous organizations like ICRC and MSF and others who are doing their best. But the truth is, these people are still lost. And the truth is that we hear news each day of more of them dying or being killed. So for those families who I met, those young people who I met, each day is a day of terrible anxiety, uncertainty, a day where the future might stop. This is their right. This is a humanitarian issue of the highest importance, finding these people and getting them home. In 26 days also, close to 9,000 Palestinians have been killed in the hostilities in Gaza. And God knows how many more there are uncounted under the rubble. As we all know from other places, that the numbers, the real numbers of those dead, only emerge much later when the buildings are cleared, the rubble is taken away, and the bodies of those who've perished become revealed. This total of 9,000 is 4 times as many deaths as during the 50-day conflict in 2014, where just over 2,200 Palestinians were killed. 9,000 Palestinians dead from that early day of October 7th. I don't know if we can cue the recording or not of my discussions with... No, we can't. Sorry, nobody hearing me. Shall I start again? Don't worry. I spoke to some of the families in Gaza. I couldn't get in and out of Gaza. And what you would have heard was the story of 2 families. One family, the father of which was a lawyer, like me, about my age probably, very old, and his house had been destroyed one midnight. And in his house lived the extended family, as is quite common in Gaza. And as he said, he spent that next day or 2 doing 2 things. Trying desperately to find somewhere to live, and thank God for UNRWA. Thank God for UNRWA, as we will hear more, and from Tom, who is there daily, bravely working. They found some refuge, some safety in a school of UNRWA where they could stay the night where they're still living. That was the first thing he had to do. The second thing he had to do was, with his own hands, bury 30 members of his family who had been killed that night in the house that now no longer existed. And what you would have heard, and I'm sure you would have been as affected as I was, suddenly an 8-year-old daughter, granddaughter presumably, suddenly interrupted the call and she said, "I just don't want to die." End of quote. I just don't want to die, that's all. So we have these parallel tragedies. And in my world and in my values, and I think it is true in all our values, one death has the value of all deaths. And one killing is a tragedy in and of itself. And this goes on day by day by day by day. And by the end of my speech, I'm sure the numbers will have changed, all for the worst. Life-sustaining connections into Gaza, which is what so many of us have been focused on in our negotiations, have been all but cut off. A couple of weeks ago, there was a full blackout. Electricity was cut off completely across Gaza. Another one, I think, happened a couple of days ago. And we understand that this will happen from time to time. 14 out of 35 hospitals with inpatient capacities, those who can take people in, are not functioning. As you have heard many of us say, UNRWA, of course, and WHO and MSF in particular, the health system is on its knees. UNRWA, the bulwark, the safety net, the buffer of so many people of Gaza for so many years, is practically out of business. I pay tribute here, as I was going to do later. I don't even know the numbers today, this morning. Yesterday it was 72 killed of UNRWA staff, those brave staff. UNRWA had 14,000 national staff in Gaza at the outset. Many of them fled, but I think 5,000 or so are still working. And I don't know how many are dead now. We'll hear more probably from Tom. One of the terrible things about those killings are that most of them have happened in the homes of those people, and they have been killed with their families. I think it's the highest number of UN staff lost in a conflict. Over 60% of the people in Gaza, that's 1.4 million people, are displaced with nowhere else to go. We know they can't get out. We know they search for the temporary shelters that UNRWA gives them, but are themselves vulnerable to attack. 500,000 children, women, and men crowded into these overcrowded shelters. And we've all seen them on our screens. We've seen the desolation of a Gaza which reminds me of the early years of the Syrian war, where we saw towns like Homs razed to the ground. The desolation of those buildings, all of which means something to each one of those people who have fled. There are intense humanitarian negotiations day and night. I've had the good fortune to not attend, to observe this, between Israeli authorities, Egyptian, the United States, thank you, Lisa, and the United Nations. And I'm grateful to all of those governments and parties and entities for the time put in to those negotiations. Because those negotiations are detailed, often produce unexpected results, sometimes don't produce results. And as of yesterday, a total of 329 trucks have entered Gaza since the 21st of October, when trucks started being allowed to move in through Rafah. Yesterday alone, from these negotiations, over 100 trucks carrying humanitarian supplies entered Gaza, the largest convoy in this terrible picture. This may sound a lot. It sounded a lot to me when I first heard it. But prior to this particular round of fighting, of conflict, of suffering, an average of 500 truckloads needed to enter Gaza every day. 500. We're praising, we are happy with 100. Well, the people of Gaza are not happy, of course, with 100. And we've seen how the people of Gaza are taking things into their own hands, and who wouldn't under these circumstances. So these negotiations, detailed and important as they are, don't do the business. We are not keeping up with the progress towards desolation, which is the story of Gaza these days. We're not keeping up. Civil order is random. The military operation is continuing. People are finding dead bodies where they had thought they weren't, have moved to places which are not safe. Some have managed to get out, as we have seen recently, but not Gazans. So we're not keeping up, despite the fact that these negotiations continue all hours of the day and night. And it is to the credit of those around that table that they do that. And they do look at issues like fuel, like water, like trucking, like access, like human rights, like international humanitarian law. They can't keep up with the needs. If I may, Lisa, if I may summarize our requirements, speaking as the representative of the humanitarian community, these are simple, clear, not easy, but not unknown. Firstly, respect, as ever, the first casualty. But respect by all parties for international humanitarian law, which ICRC continually reminds us applies in many different ways in these circumstances. That's the backdrop. That's not a priority. That's an obligation. The first, all hostages, not just the tragic numbers of children. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and indeed is required by international humanitarian law. All parties, on all sides, must protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including our humanitarian colleagues and their assets, warehouses of which where the assets have been taken away. Civilians remain entitled to protection, whether they stay or move, and they have the right to choose. And anyone who doesn't evacuate mustn't automatically be considered to support the adversary or target of an attack. And it seems banal to say that civilian infrastructure and civilian structures should not be attacked. And we say it all the time, daily in this building, do we not, about so many conflicts around the world. Gaza reminds us why this is so important, because it's these infrastructures where people live and die, and it's these infrastructures where our colleagues in UNRWA provide temporary shelter and protection. Number three, allow, of course, essential supplies and humanitarian relief, including fuel. And I heard just this morning, as I came in, that there has been some progress on allowing some more fuel in through these negotiations. I hope to see that confirmed during today, but thank you if that's the case. Fuel is essential for the functioning of institutions, of hospitals, of the distribution of water, of electricity. We must allow these supplies reliably, repetitively, and dependably into Gaza. And I think here is my main point as an aid worker. These negotiations must continue, but they are not enough. We must have those pauses. We must have those pauses. If we do not have pauses, we will not keep up with the needs of the people of Gaza and the Israelis also caught up in those areas of conflict. And then, of course, Lisa will speak to the issue of funding. Finally, Lisa, from me, too long, I want to commend, I have already commended UNRWA under the leadership of Philip Lazzarini, of Tom, who we will hear from, who is their Gaza chief. But we'll also hear from Lynn Hastings, who is our humanitarian coordinator, who I commend very highly and who works very hard with our team and the teams of all the agencies, NGOs and others, to try to make a dent in these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have, before we turn to Lynn Hastings, I thought we had the voices queued. It looks like we do not have the voices queued. So thank you very much. No. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Lynn Hastings, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and United Nations Resident Humanitarian Coordinator for the Occupied Palestinian Territory. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Excellency, I can only share Undersecretary General Griffith's alarm about this unfolding humanitarian tragedy. Without a let-up in the hostilities in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, the situation will only deteriorate. As Martin mentioned, 240 hostages remain captive. I repeat that they must be released immediately and without condition. We welcome all diplomatic efforts to secure their release and demand that, in the interim, they are treated humanely and be allowed to receive visits from the ICRC. In Gaza, the humanitarian impact has been catastrophic. It continues to deepen as Israeli strikes intensify. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, close to 9,000 people in Gaza have now been killed and more than 22,000 injured. More than 2/3 of those are estimated to be women and children. The number of displaced in Gaza stands now at 1.5 million, with more than 690,000 sheltering in UNRWA facilities and other places people hope are safe, including hospitals, churches, and schools. The reality is nowhere is truly safe. On the 2nd of November, yesterday, 4 UNRWA shelters hosting nearly 20,000 IDPs were hit. And as a result, at least 23 people were killed and dozens more injured. Since the start of hostilities, nearly 50 UNRWA facilities have been damaged, and as Martin mentioned, at least 72 staff killed. For the 22nd consecutive day, Gaza remains under a full electricity blackout following Israel's halt of the electricity and fuel supply to Gaza. Meanwhile, the backup generators that are essential for so many services, including hospitals, water desalination plants, food production facilities, have been relying on the main power are one by one grinding to a halt as fuel supplies run out. The health system is overwhelmed with an influx of injuries combined with severe shortages of supplies, personnel, electricity, and water. Since the start of the hostilities, 40% of hospitals in Gaza That's 14 of 35, which I think Martin mentioned, and nearly 71% of primary healthcare clinics, that's 51 of 72, have shut down. Only one of 3 water supply lines from Israel is now operational. Many people are relying on brackish or saline groundwater, if at all. Access to food is becoming increasingly a concern. People are braving airstrikes to line up outside of bakeries to obtain bread, a number of which have already been closed down due to lack of fuel. Cooling chains for perishable goods have broken down, and there is a complete closure of shops and food processing facilities. The agreement to use the Rafah crossing from Egypt to get essential humanitarian supplies into Gaza has provided a little relief to people living in these appalling conditions. And while we welcome this important development, these deliveries, which are the result of extensive negotiations, cannot cover the significant rise in humanitarian need. And most crucially, these recent deliveries do not include fuel that is essential, as I've said, to powering essential services that people need to survive. I have to highlight that humanitarian assistance is not enough to sustain a population of 2.2 million people. For civilians across Gaza to get access to adequate food, water, medical care, and other essential supplies, we must be able to scale up deliveries of all these goods, and we must be able to replenish fuel supplies to scale. We pledge to do our part to ensure these deliveries increase and continue. But in no crisis does the humanitarian community work alone. The private sector, the NGOs, they must be protected. And it will also be important to open other crossings for these purposes. It is also imperative that the parties respect their obligations under international law and our collective responsibility to use all our influence to ensure they do so. Sanity, humanity, and international law must prevail. Humanitarian ceasefires will ease the epic human suffering and make humanitarian access easier and safer. Next week, the humanitarian country team will issue the updated flash appeal for the occupied Palestinian territory. The cost of meeting the needs of the entire population of Gaza and 500,000 people in the West Bank until the end of the year are estimated to be $1.2 billion. Our ability to implement even part of this plan depends, of course, on many things: funding, our ability to scale up, efficient verification mechanisms that take into account security issues, access to sufficient fuel, and the use of other crossings, and humanitarian partners having safe and sustained access to all people in need. I want to end by again repeating and expressing my utmost admiration for the bravery and extraordinary commitment of those delivering life-saving and humanitarian services. And of course, again, tribute to the over 70 UNRWA colleagues who have tragically been killed. I do want to highlight that this includes the staff, many of whom have been displaced themselves and who continue to support the most vulnerable, despite UNRWA still facing a very significant fiscal deficit, which means most of these staff, or maybe all of these staff, their salaries are still in doubt. And this is at a time when we expect UNRWA and their staff to carry almost the entire burden of this crisis on their shoulders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for providing us with the situation on the ground, as well as the need for financial support to support the humanitarian assistance. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Thomas White, who's Director of United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestine Refugees and Near East Affairs in Gaza. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm joining you from the UNRWA Rafah log base in Gaza. I'm very conscious that you meet in New York under the UN flag, and I'm sure that the flag is flying over the East River there. We too have the UN flag here in Gaza. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are also sheltering under the UN flag here. But my message is that, increasingly, this situation here is pushing us to the brink. We don't want to get to the day where the UN flag is not flying in Gaza, because really it is the only hope for people now in Gaza. Firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to my colleagues who've lost their lives. At last count, it was 72. Every time I ask for an update, I fear, in fact, I know that that number will grow. This is taking an enormous toll on so many families within the UNRWA family, but also everybody you speak to, whether it be IDPs or people out on the street, they all have a story of loss. So we very much are part of the community that are grieving. But I'd also like to pay tribute to the UNRWA colleagues, but also more broadly, every Gazan who is working as an emergency worker to support their community. They are putting their community above their own lives. They are out there every day in danger, providing services. The majority of the staff in UNRWA who are working on a daily basis are actually living as IDPs themselves. Having travelled the length and breadth of Gaza in the last few weeks, it is a scene of death and destruction. Let's be very clear, there is no place that is safe in Gaza right now. People fear for their lives, people fear for their futures, and now people are fearing that they will not be able to feed their families on a day-to-day basis. The major challenges we face are sustaining an aid operation under these circumstances, operating in a situation where civil order, law and order is on the brink of collapse, and trying to comprehend, trying to plan for how we will cope with the potential for another wave of displacement into the south. I'd like to give you a sense of our operation right now. The first thing I'd like to say is the current operation is essentially being sustained by stocks that we already had in Gaza prior to the conflict. To give you a sense, we were already running a food program between UNRWA and the World Food Programme that was providing 50 to 60% of the calorific need for 1.5 million people. So people were already living on the breadline in Gaza, and they were supported by the international community. Essentially, with those stocks, we've been able to maintain the bread market in Gaza. Currently, we are supporting bakeries, about 89 bakeries across Gaza, aiming to get bread to 1.7 million people. We are pushing out about 370 tonnes of wheat flour into Gaza. The bread anybody buys at a bakery now is essentially bread or is made with wheat flour from UNRWA. The reality, though, is that the average Gazan is living on 1 or 2 pieces of hubez, Arabic bread, little rounds of bread per day. The water situation is of great concern. With the fuel supplies that we've managed to secure from within Gaza, we are managing to support the Coastal Water Authority for desalination, also to sustain desalination plants that we have in many of the camps and also a lot of the schools that we operate. But the refrain from people on the street right now, and we took our Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, into one of the internally displaced centres the other day, and everybody was pointing to their mouth and saying, Maya, water, water. So now people are beyond looking for bread, it's looking for water. I want to give you a sense of what a shelter looks like. Now we have, close to 600,000 people sheltering in 149 shelters. The reality is we've lost contact with many of the shelters in the north, but just to give you a sense of, the shelters that I'm visiting in the south. These are essentially schools. Each school is designed on any given day to have 1,000 students attend that school. So, but the reality is now we are well over 4,000 or an average of 4,000 IDPs living in those schools. We don't have the resources to maintain the sanitation. Women and children are sleeping in the classroom. The men are sleeping out in the open. The conditions are desperate in these shelters. But in many cases, they are the lucky ones. Many people are building makeshift shelters with whatever material they can find and are essentially living in the open. The medical situation is dire. I've been up to Shifa Hospital last week. The two overwhelming images for me were that every flat surface either had somebody who'd been injured or somebody who was sheltering in the hospital because they thought it was a safe place. The other enduring image of a visit to Shifa was standing in the courtyard. You could hear the airstrikes and see the airstrikes coming into the suburbs around Shifa Hospital, and literally on the clock, within 10 minutes, the ambulances started coming through. Essentially, there were people just lying, very badly injured people lying on the floor of the ambulances. The triage at the back of the ambulance was who's dead, who's alive. Those who were alive with horrific blast injuries, burn injuries, were taken into an already overwhelmed emergency department, and the people who were dead were then taken literally about 25 metres away to an open-air morgue. In terms of protection of civilians, people are, and I come back to this idea that people are sheltering under a UN flag. The reality is we cannot even provide them safety under a UN flag. We've had over 50 of our facilities that have been impacted by the conflict, including 5 direct hits. I think at last count, 38 people have died in our shelters. I fear that with the fighting going on in the north right now, that number is going to grow significantly. These are people seeking shelter under a UN flag, seeking protection under international humanitarian law. I'd echo Lynn's comments that humanitarian aid is not the only solution to the problem here. We have to focus on ensuring that the public and the private sector operate. To give you a sense, the municipal services in Gaza are the ones who are pumping the sewage out of the cities. Right now, they're not going to treatment plants, it's being pumped into the sea. But when you speak to municipal workers, the reality is once their fuel runs out, that sewage will flow in the streets. Similarly, we need to be working alongside the private sector. And the example I'll provide here is cooking gas. Cooking gas is becoming increasingly in short supply. Cooking gas was brought in a back-to-back operation prior to the conflict from Egypt, and the distribution was with the private sector. Aid organisations such as UNRWA are not going to be able to step in and replicate the network of distribution by the private sector for this essential item being cooking gas. I won't comment further on the issues of convoy and fuel. I think Martin and Lynn have spoken to that. But in my own reflection in sort of 20 years of working as a humanitarian, never have I been working with a group of humanitarians who are in fact have had such a large loss of life from within their community, and in fact are overwhelmingly IDPs and recently displaced, and never have been in a situation where we are effectively starved of the vital humanitarian supplies that we need to provide to people. The toughest thing is with our staff who are serving in these IDP shelters is they know what they need to deliver for the people, but they just don't have it in their hands. Pardon me. Finally, we need regular and sustained humanitarian supplies and access alongside the public and private sector. And finally, and this is a call from the people here, they need a ceasefire. They want a ceasefire now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that poignant and very stark first-hand account. Before I open the floor to the list of speakers, I'd like to quickly turn back to our Undersecretary General, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at Osama, actually. I was in Egypt the other day and had the privilege of meeting senior Egyptian officials, your foreign minister. The Secretary General has been in touch with President Sisi, and Egypt has been an extraordinarily helpful partner under very, very difficult circumstances, as we all know in this moment, with the threat of being overwhelmed by numbers of people trying to get into Egypt. What I want to say about Egypt also makes me think about other places. I don't think Egypt has refused a single visa for people coming in, like visitors like that. I think that's almost a unique record. So, Osama, thank you for that. It's very important. Number two, Egypt has indeed worked very hard to craft an agreement with the humanitarian leadership that we have on screen here, Lynn and Tom and others, to have a presence in El Arish, the airport not far from Rafah, and then possibly moving towards Rafah. And I don't underestimate the difficulty of that decision by the Egyptian government, but I don't underestimate the importance of it for our functioning operations. So, Osama, thank you for that as well. And then thirdly, Egypt, through its people, through its Red Crescent, who I had the privilege to meet the head of your Egyptian Red Crescent, along with the Dr. Marwan, Dr. Rami from the Egyptian Red Crescent, Dr. Marwan from the Palestinian Red Crescent, obviously a heroic figure under these circumstances. We met both of them in Cairo the other day. And you know, one of the good things, one of the very few good things about humanitarian crises is that you discover where you, in a place you've never been before, people who share your values as they do ours. So, Osama, we thank your government. We rely on you, of course, as a partner. You're fully involved in these negotiations, and you've always been very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'd like to open the floor to interventions and remind you to unmute your mic when it is your turn to speak. And also, please keep your interventions to 2 minutes. We are well over time at the moment, so please do keep your interventions to 2 minutes. And I would like to first offer the floor to a representative from Saudi Arabia, followed by Qatar and Egypt. So the floor is yours, Representative from Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. I will be speaking in Arabic. بداية نشكر المتحدثين على الإحاطة ونعبر عن قلقنا حيال التطور المؤسف للأوضاع الإنسانية في قطاع غزة، وندين بأشد العبارات ونرفض استهداف المدنيين وجميع الانتهاكات والتجاوزات القانون الدولي الإنساني، بما في ذلك استهداف البنية التحتية والمنشآت المدنية. نطالب بالوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار والعمليات العسكرية في غزة وإنهاء الحصار الإسرائيلي غير القانوني وضمان توفير المساعدات الإنسانية والإغاثية والاحتياجات الأساسية واستئناف خطوط الكهرباء والمياه والسماح بدخول الوقود والغذاء والدواء لسكان غزة. نحن لا نشعر بالأسى والحزن على وفاة وإصابة آلاف المدنيين الأبرياء فحسب، بل نشعر بالغضب والإحباط بسبب عجز المجتمع الدولي عن المساعدة حتى بالماء والغذاء والدواء، وأيضا بسبب العجز عن إيقاف مزيد من القتل والتهجير حتى لأولئك الذين يقطنون في مقرات الأمم المتحدة. أطلقت المملكة حملة شعبية لإغاثة الشعب الفلسطيني تمكنت خلال يومين من إطلاقها من جمع مبلغ 400 مليون ريال سعودي حتى الآن، أي حوالي 70 مليون دولار. إن دور الأمم المتحدة والأوتشا محوري في ضمان بيئة آمنة للعمل الإنساني بما فيها الممرات الإنسانية. ختاما، نود التأكيد على أهمية وجوب احترام القانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان. وشكرا.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now offer the floor to the representative from Qatar.
Thank you so much. I would like to as well thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for convening this important briefing, and I would like to thank both Lynn Hastings and Thomas White for their detailed and comprehensive briefing about the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip. Let me begin by stating that Qatar is extremely concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and its vast consequences for the civilian population, which is largely comprised of children and women. This underlines the need for the full, immediate, safe, unhindered, and sustained humanitarian access, which is also called for by the General Assembly resolution that was adopted during the emergency special session last Friday. We have called for the immediate provision of essential goods and services to the population, including water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity. We stressed the imperative under international humanitarian law of ensuring that civilians are not deprived of goods and services indispensable to their survival. The State of Qatar, of course, strongly condemns the Israeli attacks targeting innocent civilians and civilian objects. Tragically, thousands of children have been accounted for, either killed or missing, buried under the rubble. Qatar has consistently called for an immediate ceasefire, the escalation of hostilities, the exercise of utmost restraint, and the protection of civilians to prevent a wider cycle of violence. As part of our humanitarian efforts, Qatar recently dispatched 3 planes carrying food and medical supplies. To date, Qatar's assistance has reached a total of 124 tons, a lifeline for the Palestinian people facing these challenges and devastating humanitarian catastrophe. We are committed also to support the core funding of UNRWA of $18 million for the years 2023 and 2024, and ready to address the emergency calls as well. Qatar Red Crescent Society allocated $1 million from its disaster response fund for an immediate emergency intervention plans aimed at providing critical needs of medicine, medical supplies, and ambulance vehicles. I would like to also acknowledge, of course, that Qatar remains steadfast in its commitment to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people and addressing their urgent humanitarian needs. We call on the UN Security Council to take up its responsibility to reach an agreement on a Security Council resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire and an immediate entry of humanitarian assistance, and to as well put an end for the targeting of innocent civilians in the Gaza Strip. And I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative from Egypt.
Thank you very much, distinguished moderator, USG Martin, our heroes on the ground, Thomas, Lynn, and everyone who's operating to save the Palestinian innocent lives in the middle of that crazy war that is ongoing. You were kind enough to thank Egypt, Martin, but it's a call of duty. Egyptians were doing what we should do and what any country here present would have done. Very proud of fulfilling our duty, but it's high time for me to thank you personally, because I knew what you were doing to make difference on the ground and so on. To thank the SG himself. He has been there in Rafah crossing for saying and doing what needs to be done. And you're very right, Martin. It's those difficult moments show the real values that we all share for the value of a human spirit and so on. For our heroes on the ground, putting the UN flag up, you should be very proud. We totally recognize and respect your great role, and I couldn't agree more with you, Martin, on the need for an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, immediate. This is what we were saying last Friday when we voted in the GA, and for those who have voted no or whatever, you're listening on the ground, look at the tolls, and then you would get to realize. For us as Egyptians, we're working on the modalities to facilitate the lifting to trucks. So hopefully we'll maintain that rate. Fuel continues to be who had the resources to help mobilizing sufficient resources for UNRWA and for who had the political weight to persuade those who negate up till the moment. Other than that, you see, it's shameful. So we need to keep mobilizing what I would qualify as the global public opinion. Stop the war, invest in peace, save lives, as we are seeing the toll arises of the victims in Gaza. This is what I wanted to say in brief. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite the representative from Jordan, followed by Canada, European Union, and State of Palestine. So the representative from Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank USG Martin Griffith for his briefing, and also I'd like to thank our colleagues from UNRWA and OCHA on the ground, Ms. Hastings and Mr. Thomas White. This is very sobering indeed, what we heard from you on the situation in Gaza. It's truly a humanitarian disaster that's occurring before our eyes. When you see 67% of the Palestinians killed in Gaza are women and children. 14 Palestinian civilians are killed every hour. 6 Palestinian children killed every hour. 4 Palestinian women killed every hour. How long do you have to wait until we act as an international community? When you hear the humanitarian actors pleading with you to allow access in, and we see that it is trickling down. You're talking about 329 trucks so far entering Gaza, and daily it's around 500 trucks before this situation erupted on 7 October. That's outrageous. Egypt is trying its to allow humanitarian aid in. We know how much the hurdles that the Israelis are putting in this, and we hear their ministers talking about how it is transactional. We allowed in as an exchange for what is required from them to do with regard to the hostages and other detained persons. That's unacceptable. This is a crime under international law. This is a huge crime. If you don't call them out for what they're doing and let aid in, they will continue to do so. That must stop, and the UN narrative must continue as such. You are guided by the ESS 10 resolution. This is how it is. We have to stop the war. We have to allow humanitarian aid in. We have to stop the transfer of people. This is how it is. The humanitarian situation will continue to deteriorate before our eyes and for your eyes. If you put it in perspective, and I hate to make comparisons in this regard, all human lives are important. Israeli, Palestinian, Ukrainian. How many children killed in the Ukraine war in 20 months? 600. How many children, Palestinian children killed in less than 4 weeks? 3,700. Is this acceptable? How many Ukrainians were killed? And I'm sorry to make this reference, or the civilians killed in the Ukraine war. 9,600. As of this morning, 9,300 Palestinians killed in 20 days, civilians. This is outrageous. And this has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative from Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Griffiths for his report. Just say a couple of things very briefly. First of all, I certainly appreciated, Martin, that you paid attention to the situation of October the 7th and the disastrous consequences of that for human life, for human suffering, and a suffering that continues because of the ongoing holding of the hostages. I think we all have to understand that that's true, and it needs to be stated. Secondly, I think all of us support what you've said about the respect for international humanitarian law by all the actors. That includes not putting civilians at risk because of where military infrastructure is placed in Gaza. That has to be understood as something that needs to be addressed. We all, as parties, have an obligation to protect human life, and we all have an obligation to protect civilian infrastructure. Canada, and this has been indicated clearly by my Prime Minister and by the Minister, are strongly in favor of a humanitarian pause, and we need to have a humanitarian corridor in order to get supplies in. We have committed already $60 million in additional assistance. We have goods, food, and other things ready to go. And we also very much appreciate the assistance that we have received from the government of Egypt, from the government of Israel, and from the government of the United States in the negotiations around Canadian citizens being allowed to leave Gaza. And we appreciate deeply the steps that are being taken to move that through quickly. I think it's important that we understand the full dimensions of this crisis. I fully believe that every humanitarian crisis has a political cause. This is a classic example of one of those that does. This is not the time or place to engage in a political debate. I have no intention of doing so, but I think it's very important for all of us to look for the ground where we agree. We agree that humanitarian assistance must be increased. We agree it must get in as quickly as possible. We agree it must be expanded. And we agree that there must be a pause in the hostilities in order to allow that to be expanded to the extent that is required. And that's ground on which we can agree, and we should be moving quickly to push forward in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative from the European Union.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for the update. And I just want to say that I think we're all horrified over the plight of the civilians that is currently playing out in front of our eyes. I think we're horrified for the lack of ability we as professionals have had to prevent this. And now we're horrified by the limitations of assisting people in need. And I think it also is horrifying from a human being perspective as well. I think we all feel powerless in front of this situation, but therefore all the more admiration for the work that all of you who have briefed us today and your staff, and great respect and condolences to all the fallen UN staff from UNRWA and elsewhere. We have, over the last few weeks, spoken about our positions on this crisis, including the absolute respect for international humanitarian law, the need for all hostages to be released, that all civilians need to be protected and civilian infrastructure, that essential supplies needs to be allowed in and in scale, as you were saying, and that all necessary measures must be taken in order to allow that, be that humanitarian corridors, pauses, whatever is needed. We also stepped up our own assistance, tripling humanitarian support to the Palestinians in Gaza. We've consistently supported UNRWA politically, financially. We ask others to step up as well, especially in this very difficult time. And we've provided for air flights, special air flights to Egypt to allow for the humanitarian assistance to be provided there when the situation allows for that to be then deployed. So my question is really, just repeating again and again everything we said, and you made those points, Martin, others have made those points, the General Assembly has made those points. What else can we do right now as big donors in our case? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of the State of Palestine, then followed by Sweden, Libya, and Pakistan. The floor to the State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam. I just want to be very frank with you. I listened to you in previous reporting, whether in the Security Council or in other groupings here. What I heard from you today lacked the intensity and the humanity that you have demonstrated in previous reporting. You did not talk about the huge elephant in the room of the crime being committed against the Palestinian people, the children, the women, the wounded, depriving them in a huge collective punishment of no electricity, no fuel, no medicine, no food, no water. You described that situation as a catastrophic situation, and many of you said that it is borderline of crime against humanity and genocide. And the reporting today did not ask for the thing that you asked for forcefully: ceasefire, stop the killing, stop murdering the Palestinians in this massive, large number. The General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for these things, and then the reporting today is stale. You are officers reporting on the work related to the humanitarian field. I know the brave rank and file of your organizations are the brave ones who are really acting according to their mandate and their full commitment to protect the Palestinian people, to help the Palestinian people, to tell the story of the devastations of demolishing almost 50% of all of the structures in the Gaza Strip. This is what you used to tell us in your previous reporting. I think you should continue to be consistent in telling the story as it is, not to try to customize the narrative for whatever reasons. I'm speaking to you because it is my duty to transmit to each and every one of you the massive pain and horror that the Palestinian civilians, especially the children who constitute half of the population of the Gaza Strip. We salute UNRWA and OCHA and all those who are, working in the field. I saw the tears, in the eyes of Lynn Hastings in the Security Council when we were talking about the numbers of the horrors related to the Palestinian people. And of course, I wanted to see Lazzarini, who went to the field, and he saw firsthand inside Gaza the horror and the situation there. We are entitled to listen to his reporting and to his, recommendations. I listened to him very closely when he spoke in the Security Council, saying that there is a huge catastrophe unfolding in the Gaza Strip. It has to stop. A ceasefire should be the first order of the day. Now it changed from ceasefire to pauses, which means Israel continue killing the Palestinians, but give us a few hours every now and then in order to get food and other stuff, but continue the fighting. You are the responsible of defending humanity and human beings and the civilians. You should be saying clearly and loudly, in line of, IHL, that a ceasefire should take place, saving lives should take place, an immediate cessation of all of these hostilities should take place. This is what I expect from you, because you are the responsible individuals and organizations for protecting life. When war takes place, the first thing that is needed, ceasefire, in order to save human beings, not to continue the war and to allow for a few hours every now and then to allow truckloads of assistance to take place. And let me conclude, I think the gentleman from UNRWA, Tom, when he says that ceasefire that the Palestinian people are asking for, are you, the officers of the humanitarian field, you're not asking for ceasefire? Only the Palestinians, the victims who are being killed and their children under the rubbles are the ones only asking for ceasefire? I thought that Mr. Lazzarini and even Mr. Griffith himself in the Security Council the other day, they said the first thing that we need is a ceasefire. I am, sorry for, being extremely frank with you, because the situation of the Palestinian people in Gaza is beyond comprehension and beyond, description, and it requires from all of us to do everything that we can to stop it, and to stop it yesterday, not even today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now call for the representative from Sweden to take the floor.
Thank you very much, and let me first thank OCHA and Martin Griffith for convening this meeting, but also the other briefers, not only for your very sobering messages and for bringing us from this conference room to the horrendous humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza, but also for everything that you're doing, you and your staff, on the ground under very difficult circumstances. Sweden is gravely concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. We support efforts for rapid, safe, unhindered and sustained humanitarian access and aid through all necessary measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Sweden deeply regrets the death of many civilians and the UN personnel. We reiterate our call for full respect of international law and international humanitarian law. This year, Sweden has already disbursed around $13 million in humanitarian aid to Palestine. This is on top of our substantial core funding to UN agencies active on the ground, not least UNRWA, who plays a crucial role in extremely difficult conditions. Sweden has supported UNRWA with around $40 million this year. We are pleased to see $9 million allocated from the Central Emergency Response Fund. Sweden has supported SURF with around $60 million this year, making us the third largest donor. Yesterday, Sweden announced $13 million, 150 million Swedish kronor, in new humanitarian aid challenged through the WFP, UNICEF, UNFPA, and ICRC. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Libya and the chair of the Arab Group.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Griffith, for your briefing, and colleagues from UNRWA. First of all, our condolences for the loss of lives of the UN staff. And yes, Mr. Griffith, this number is actually the highest toll in a conflict. But why is it happening? That's the question. By the time we finish this meeting, we know that dozens of other lives will be lost. And I want to also remind everyone, this is not only happening in Gaza. Let's not forget what's happening in the West Bank right now against Palestinians, where there's no militant act, where unfortunately, again, the representative of Canada keeps putting it a one-sided story and not putting things into context. You cannot justify the killing of 9,000 civilians under the excuse of what's called the right of self-defense. That's an occupier. An occupier doesn't have that right by killing this number. There's no place safe in Gaza. That's what your director said now from there. No place is safe. So the claim of having a north place to be evacuated where the south is safe is not true, it's false. We all have to recall that. The targeting of Jabalia refugee camp twice is an evidence of this kind of atrocity that it cannot be silenced anymore. Therefore, I'm questioning, where are those human rights defenders? Where are those who are preaching us all the time about women's rights, children armed conflict? Where are you? Where are the special envoys on those matters? Why are they silent? History will not forgive, so speak up. Again, Mr. Griffith, you should not be using the word humanitarian pause in your statements. This is not acceptable. This is not a movie where we'll be watching and holding a play button, then pause and play again. These are lives. The UN should call for ceasefire, not for pauses. Dehumanizing Palestinians is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. All lives matter. This is a conflict where everybody in the world now is looking into it and seeing the hypocrisy and double standards. All life matters. Depriving more than 2 million citizens, civilians, from food, water, fuel is a war crime. We have to say that. That is a war crime. If it's not, then what is? We as an Arab group have took the path towards pushing for 3 main requirements: an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian aid to be entered immediately, and to stop this forced transfer of people. You saw the overwhelming support from the GA in the time of failure of Security Council. But still, we do count on everyone to wake up and translate that overwhelming support that happened to have something happen on the ground. We all acknowledge the hard work of the UN staff on the ground and those who are in the front lines. But I think we all hold a responsibility, especially those who are unfortunately being silent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And given we are running over time, I would like to remind all speakers to please limit your interventions to 2 minutes. Now I'd like to turn to the representative of Pakistan, followed by United States, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. So, representative of Pakistan, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We are grateful to Martin and Ms. Hastings, Mr. Tom White, for providing a briefing on the factual situation on the ground in the, what I would call, the killing zone of Gaza. Pakistan has provided humanitarian assistance through Egypt to the Gazans, and we will continue to do our best to provide medicines, doctors, whatever is needed to help in ameliorating the plight of the people of Gaza. What I would like to do at this time is to underline that if humanitarianism is the primary concern for all of us, for the international community and for the United Nations, the actions that we need to take besides the supplies that have to flow, the actions we need to take have already been approved by the United Nations General Assembly. And what is there for us is to implement that resolution of the General Assembly adopted with 121 votes. This is the obligation of the Secretary General. This is the obligation of all elements of the United Nations to seek an immediate ceasefire, to seek a continuation of sustained supplies for the besieged Gazans, and to prevent a further displacement of the people of Gaza. Everything else is special pleading. When my friend from Canada, I don't want to pick on Canada again, but I'm afraid, having heard him again this morning, I must say I am amazed that a humanitarian Canada can once again put forward the kind of arguments he did about the need to release the hostages, but not the 9,000 Palestinians or 90,000 Palestinians that have been arbitrarily arrested and kept in Israeli prisons. Talk about that too. He talks about calling for a humanitarian truce. Well, the General Assembly has called for a humanitarian truce leading to the cessation of hostilities. That is our obligation to do today. Anyone calling for a humanitarian pause to allow the Israelis to stop for 5 minutes and then bomb the Palestinians again, I think this is contrary to international humanitarian law, to the obligations of international humanitarian law, a violation of the obligations that they have undertaken as parties to all the international humanitarian conventions. A violation by taking that position. And also by taking the position that if military targets are placed or suspected to be somewhere, that it is all right for the Israelis to bomb them. If there was a target in the Ahli hospital, would it be just for the Israelis to bomb the hospital? Where does international law justify this? International humanitarian law is categorical. You cannot target civilian sites and civilian facilities, especially not hospitals. Even if there was a military target there, which is not proven. How did the Israelis ever proved that any of the schools that they have bombed, any of the hospitals that they have destroyed, any of the refugee camps which they have bombarded, has Israel proved that there was a military target remotely there? They are doing this as collective punishment. This is unfortunately a people who suffered the Holocaust, a people who suffered the genocide, committing the modern genocide. And we must call it for what it is. Let's not mince words. Let us, as the international community, adhere to what the General Assembly has said. Let us adhere to what the international humanitarian law says. This is our obligation. We cannot mince our words. We have to tell the Israelis, stop the genocide. This is what we expect from the Secretary General. This is what we expect from you, Martin. This is what we expect from all those who are leading the United Nations, all those who are speaking for the conscience of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the Representative of the United States.
Martin, for your leadership, and many thanks to Lynn and Tom for being with us this morning and for the critical work that they're doing. To the UNRWA colleagues, we join you in mourning the loss of members of your team. We're moved by the dedication of UNRWA and other humanitarian staff who, even in the face of their own displacement and danger, continue to serve others. There is simply no replacement for the critical role of the UN, particularly of UNRWA. The United States has been clear that the lives of all civilians, including UN personnel and humanitarian workers, must be protected. We've also been clear in our unequivocal condemnation of the attacks by Hamas terrorists. Hamas has shown absolutely no respect for human life. Hamas has killed more than 1,400 people in Israel, uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, and continues to hold hostages. President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken have underscored publicly and privately that as Israel exercises its right to defend itself, it must do so in line with international humanitarian law. Secretary Blinken recently said, "The lives of Palestinian civilians must be protected. This means the flow of food, water, medicine, fuel, and other essential humanitarian aid into Gaza must increase immediately and significantly. It means Palestinian civilians must be able to stay out of harm's way. It means every possible precaution must be taken to safeguard humanitarian rights, and it means humanitarian pauses must be considered for these purposes." These words are backed by actions. As we speak, Secretary Blinken is again in the region, his second trip in 3 weeks. He is pursuing these objectives, including humanitarian pauses to allow aid to reach Gaza and be distributed, and to allow safe passage for civilians, which will help people access humanitarian assistance or move to safer locations. He also will focus on concrete steps to be taken to minimize harm to men, women, and children. Since his appointment as U.S. Special Envoy for Humanitarian Issues, Ambassador David Satterfield has also worked to facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid. As a result, food, water, and medical supplies have begun to move into Gaza, but we know that much more is urgently needed. We are working with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to expand and sustain these efforts. The United States has committed an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance, bringing total aid to the Palestinian people to more than $1 billion in the last 2.5 years. We call on others to join us urgently in meeting the UN's appeal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa, and of course to you, Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths. And I want to start by expressing our deep appreciation to you, Martin, for your tireless efforts in recent weeks, and of course to the work of the UN and all humanitarian partners for their life-saving efforts in such incredibly challenging circumstances. And like others, I of course also want to share the UK's condolences to the families and friends of all UNRWA colleagues who have lost their lives, and to all Palestinians and Israelis who have lost loved ones. In response to this acute humanitarian crisis, the UK has significantly stepped up our humanitarian efforts. Our Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary and UN Minister Lord Ahmed have all visited the region over the last 2 weeks, focused on these efforts and on 3 key priorities. First, the UK has been clear that all sides must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. That means that every possible precaution must be taken to protect civilians wherever they are. It also means that all hostages must be released immediately, safely, and without conditions. Second, the UK continues to call for immediate, unimpeded, and safe humanitarian access to Gaza, so that life-saving aid, including water, fuel, medicine and food, can reach the civilians who so desperately need it. Piped water supplies and allowing fuel to enter Gaza are essential to allow hospitals and other critical infrastructure to operate. And we urge all parties to allow for humanitarian pauses, which would ensure safe aid delivery and critical repairs to key infrastructure, including water and electricity. Whilst we welcome, of course, the reopening of Rafah crossing, we are aware that this is not sufficient to meet the soaring needs. And so we urge the opening of other border crossings, such as Kerem Shalom, as well as increased access through existing commercial routes, such as Port Said, to enable more humanitarian aid to reach civilians in need. And finally, we have increased our funding to the humanitarian response to support our partners and the people of Gaza. We have committed a further $37 million in humanitarian assistance since October the 16th, doubling the UK's commitment to the occupied Palestinian territories this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before I give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands, I wanted to just let you know that we'll extend this session to 11:10 due to the number of interventions that we have. But I would again remind you to please keep your interventions to 2 minutes, please, so we can get through the pre-registered speakers list. So now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Netherlands, and followed by Iceland, Cyprus, and Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to the presenters, the briefers, for their presentations today, Martin, Lynn, and Thomas. And I think once again we cannot but be shocked by what we just heard, shocked by the number of innocent lives lost, among them, as we've heard often, many children, and shocked by the suffering of many more people, and by the number of UN staff that lost their lives. And we pay tribute to the brave UN staff and other humanitarian workers that continue to work tirelessly under extremely difficult circumstances. I'll just make 3 points in the interest of time. First, we repeat that international humanitarian law must be respected, and agree with the Secretary General that every possible measure must be taken to protect innocent civilians, to keep UN premises safe, and to allow UN staff to do their essential life-saving work safely and unhindered. But, and that's my second point, I think the truth is that nobody here in New York can even begin to imagine what the situation in Gaza is. We've heard what is needed, secure, safe, and unhindered humanitarian action, access, food, water, fuel, medicine that needs to be allowed in immediately, and we thank those that are working to achieve that. And as you said, Martin, also life-sustaining connections must continue to operate. We've heard the 329 trucks that have entered so far, but we also know that it pales in comparison to what is needed, and that is an immediate and massive scale-up of assistance, and we need to do all we can to make that possible, starting with humanitarian pauses and corridors, as you just said. We've also heard, of course, that funding is urgently needed. The Netherlands has already committed an additional 25 million euros for urgent humanitarian relief, 8 million of which is for UNRWA, and comes on top of our annual contribution of 19 million euros. And we encourage others to do the same. But, the essential thing is we must urgently break the cycle of violence, stop the loss of more lives, more suffering, and more futures shattered. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative of Iceland.
My appreciation goes to the briefers, and at the outset let me also commend humanitarian actors for their relentless efforts to ease the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza. We deeply regret the devastating loss of all civilian life in the current conflict and that of UNRWA staff. My country deplores the immense suffering inflicted on civilians and underlines that civilian objects, medical personnel, and humanitarian workers and assets must be protected. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected at all times. We welcome that humanitarian convoys have started entering Gaza and thank the UN for continued leadership in this regard. We also join the call for humanitarian pause and corridors to facilitate immediate, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and the delivery of life-saving assistance throughout Gaza. And obviously more aid is urgently needed and at scale, in particular fuel, water, food, and medicine. Now, recognizing the importance of flexible funding in these trying times, Iceland has responded to the call for urgent humanitarian assistance with 2 additional unearmarked core contributions to UNRWA, which is our long-standing humanitarian partners. That is a total of $1 million. And earlier this year, we renewed our multi-year agreement with UNRWA for another 5 years for annual core funding, and we remain predictable donor to OCHA-led country-based pool fund in the OPT. And further contributions for humanitarian assistance are currently under consideration by my government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Undersecretary General, for the briefing and for your exceptional efforts and work in dealing with this unfortunate crisis. As a country in the region, Cyprus is fully aware of the scale and potential repercussions of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the need to urgently address this alarming situation, including by ensuring the continued, rapid and safe and unhindered flow of humanitarian aid, cannot be emphasized enough. Cyprus is in consultation and cooperation with all immediate stakeholders and other partners in order to practically facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid beyond the first response to address the dire humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip. And in this context, we have proposed the establishment of a maritime humanitarian corridor from Cyprus, which would effectively contribute to alleviating the constantly increasing assistance necessities, taking into account the need to secure the sustained, regulated, robust and high-volume flow of humanitarian aid. Cyprus's geographical proximity to Gaza, as well as existing capabilities, places us in an optimal position to establish a reliable and viable humanitarian maritime corridor, both as a mid- and long-term necessity for the day beyond, which would serve to decompress the Rafah crossing, which, with full consideration of the security aspect, we will be engaging directly with the UN on the operationalization of this initiative. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative Ireland, followed by Australia, France, and then Malaysia.
Thank you, Moderator. And firstly, sincere thanks to OCHA, UNRWA and the Deputy Special Coordinator for your leadership, for this briefing and for the life-saving work your colleagues are carrying out in Gaza. We wish to thank you for your sustained commitment during these most challenging of circumstances as we witness a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. We are appalled by the loss of life of men, women and children and the suffering that we are now seeing in Gaza. Our condolences goes to those who have lost their lives over the last month, including those who died in the appalling Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, and it's really important to acknowledge that, but also all those who have lost their lives in Gaza, including UNRWA and other humanitarian staff. Ireland resolutely supports the United Nations and the important role, the essential role that it is now playing in the occupied Palestinian territory, and we call upon Israel to ensure continued access for all UN staff. As you have said, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is now critical. We have condemned the attacks on the 7th of October. We also call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as Martin has said. We also call on Israel to act in full compliance with international law and international humanitarian law. These laws apply in all circumstances and apply to all states. Civilians must be protected. Ireland echoes the UN Secretary-General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow essential aid to reach those in such desperate need now. There also needs to be an immediate and significant scaling up of humanitarian supplies into Gaza, as well as safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian personnel to where they are most needed, both into and within Gaza itself. In response to this humanitarian catastrophe, Ireland recently delivered additional funding of €13 million, 10 million for UNRWA and 3 million for OCHA. And this brings our 2023 support for Palestine to €29 million. It is nowhere near enough, we know that, and the really important point is that the aid gets in and in scale now. The UN General Assembly has given the agency a mandate. We must ensure it has the resources to fulfil it. We urge other partners to also step up, including by ensuring UNRWA's core functions are supported now and into the future. We need to act now and at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative Australia.
Thank you, Moderator and Under Secretary General, and I thank OCHA very much for this briefing, for the work that the United Nations is doing on the ground, and of course our sympathy and condolences for all those who have lost their lives. Excellencies, colleagues, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. Human suffering is clearly widespread. Australia reiterates our call for full compliance with international law, protection of civilian lives, and humanitarian pauses on hostilities to allow food, water, medicine and other essential assistance to reach people in desperate need and to enable civilians to get to safety. We thank our international partners for their tireless work since the beginning of this conflict to facilitate the flow of supplies through the Rafah crossing. Life-saving aid must be increased and sustained, and with the Rafah crossing, there must be accessibility for those who need to depart. Efforts to meet the significant humanitarian challenges in Gaza must continue. Our government has announced a total of 25 million Australian dollars in humanitarian assistance, which is helping to meet the urgent needs of affected communities, including women and children. Delivered through the United Nations organisations and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, this support includes access to medical support, food and emergency water, sanitation, hygiene and shelter services. Australia continues to engage with counterparts to secure greater humanitarian access to Gaza and prevent the conflict from widening. Australia stands ready to provide further support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative France.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you, Martin, for organizing this meeting. I would like to thank also our briefers, Tom, Lynn, on the ground, on the field. Thank you for this sobering, terrible account of the situation on the ground, and thank you for the essential, absolutely essential work you are doing on the field. This humanitarian tragedy is a top priority for France, and we are absolutely alarmed by the scale and the number of the civilian casualties in Gaza. We call for a humanitarian truce that could lead to a ceasefire as a next steps. We want to remind that respect for international humanitarian law is not an option, it's a moral obligation, it's an international obligation. All civilians must be protected. We have condemned in the most explicit terms the terrorist attacks from Hamas against Israel on October 7th, and there's absolutely no ambiguity on that matter. We also believe civilians in Gaza should not pay for the crimes of Hamas. We also call for all hostages to be released immediately. The humanitarian aid has started slowly to enter to Gaza Strip, and we all agree it's not enough, and that the priority remains to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza. It cannot wait any longer. Humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip must be fully open without delay. I would like to remind that France has already released 20 million euro of humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza since the beginning of this crisis, as well as a humanitarian relief plane and a hospital ship to support Gaza's medical infrastructure. And we'd like to announce that we will organize in Paris on November 9th a conference on humanitarian aid in Gaza, focused on the practical modalities of the delivery of aid, but it will also be a pledging conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative Malaysia.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you to the briefers for their updates. Malaysia acknowledges the crucial role of OCHA in the coordination of critical humanitarian response and assistance to those in need in the occupied Palestinian territory. We commend the exceptional courage and commitment of frontline humanitarian workers of the UN. Their safety and protection must be guaranteed. Our deepest condolences to the family of the deceased humanitarian workers of UNRWA. Mindful of the time limit, I would like to briefly convey 4 points. First, Malaysia joins others in demanding for an immediate ceasefire as a crucial first step to put a stop to further bloodshed and destruction, as well as to allow humanitarian work to be carried out. Second, we call for the establishment of humanitarian corridors as well as the unimpeded and unhindered humanitarian access to enable aid and assistance to reach those in need throughout Gaza. Third, there must be an immediate stop to the forced displacement of civilians in Gaza. This is not only morally repugnant, but is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Malaysia calls for the immediate provision of basic supplies of fuel, water, medicine, and electricity into Gaza. Malaysia would also like to announce that the government of Malaysia has decided to allocate an emergency contribution to UNRWA. In conclusion, I wish to reaffirm Malaysia's steadfast commitment towards just and durable peace in a free and independent Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to a representative from Belgium, followed by Spain, Croatia, and then Luxembourg. Belgium, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I'll start over. Mr. Undersecretary General, Excellencies, allow me to thank you, the humanitarian organizations, and especially the brave staff on the ground for their courage to stay and deliver in these extreme conditions. Situation in Gaza is inhumane. More than 9,000 dead, almost half of which children, hundreds missing, and over 1 million people on the run. Fuel, water, food, and medicine supplies are dwindling rapidly. Critical supplies must arrive now, and all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Humanity must prevail. Access to people in need must be full, safe, and unimpeded, including in the north of Gaza. More border crossings are needed, and access modalities have to be also logistically practicable. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties at all times, also when acting in self-defense. Civilians must be protected, humanitarian and healthcare workers must be protected. We need to come to a humanitarian ceasefire as called for by the SG. Let us also not lose sight of what is happening in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The past weeks have been the deadliest for Palestinians in Area C, and at least 13 communities have been forcibly displaced. Mr. Undersecretary General, current humanitarian aid is not sufficient. This is why Belgium added 2 million euros to the OCHA OPT CBPF fund, in addition to our existing aid to OCHA and UNRWA. Belgium emphasizes the vital role of UNRWA. We request donors to show flexibility and ask to use all possible funding mechanisms to support UNRWA in responding to this humanitarian crisis and to ensure its stability. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to a representative of Spain.
Spain wants to express our full support to the Secretary General and UN agencies, especially UNRWA and the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and our deepest condolences for all the UN personal victims. Full support for the respect of international humanitarian law, continued safe and unhindered humanitarian access, humanitarian pauses and corridors. Spain will double its aid to Palestine this year. And within the framework of the presidency of the European Union, we have activated the EU Integrated Political Crisis Response Platform to monitor the situation in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Spain, please. Oh, sorry. Croatia. Excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start by acknowledging the exceptional work of the humanitarian and medical staff present on the ground and their relentless dedication to provide life-saving assistance in these extremely strenuous and dangerous circumstances. We call for ensuring their safety and protection. Our deepest condolences go out to the families and friends of all those who lost their lives. Croatia is gravely concerned by the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. We deplore all loss of civilian life and reiterate the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times, in line with the international humanitarian law. At this time, it is of utmost importance to continue providing urgent humanitarian aid to civilians who need it most. We reiterate the importance of adhering to humanitarian principles. We call for continued, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. In recognizing the urgency and gravity of the humanitarian situation on the ground, Croatia will be deploying urgent humanitarian aid to the population of the Gaza Strip in the amount of 250,000 euros, reiterating our long-standing commitment to providing support for the efforts of the international organizations, NGOs, and other humanitarian partners in their direct humanitarian aid activities. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. And we have about 15 more speakers, so I would ask for your understanding if you could please cut your interventions to 1 minute if possible for the remaining speakers. So now we have Representative of Luxembourg, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Under Secretary General. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the challenging conditions under which the humanitarian actors currently operate in Gaza. I would also like to recognize the sacrifices made by the humanitarian workers, including those who have lost their life, and I express my deepest condolences to their families and their colleagues. Their commitment to helping others is truly inspiring. We should all scale up our assistance to respond to the massive needs on the ground. In response to the emergency flash appeals, Luxembourg has committed an additional humanitarian contribution of 2.5 million euros to the international efforts in the region, with a focus in the domains of emergency shelter, food, security, psychological support, as well as health as education. Luxembourg attributed 2.3 million euros to several humanitarian organizations in Gaza. UNRWA with 1.2 million, the ICRC, the WFP, OCHA, and the Norwegian Refugee Council. In addition to this contribution, Luxembourg supports the operation of two NGOs, Handicap International Luxembourg and Caritas Luxembourg in Lebanon and the West Bank. We need, however, a rapid, sustained, unimpeded, and safe humanitarian access for the aid to reach the people in Gaza. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to the representative of Slovenia, followed by Greece, Switzerland, and Denmark.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this briefing, and thank you for the sobering reports from the field. We commend the work of humanitarian agencies and their personnel in Gaza who continue to provide assistance and protection to the people under most dire circumstances. And I would like to also convey our condolences to all the lives that have been lost during this work. Slovenia reiterates that the international humanitarian law must be respected under all circumstances, and we call for unhindered, increased and sustained access of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Declaring humanitarian pauses and humanitarian corridors is essential for the delivery of aid and medical assistance. Slovenia reiterates its full support for the work of the UN Secretary General and the broader UN system, and we are a long-standing supporter of UNRWA. Since the beginning of the latest escalation, Slovenia has pledged additional 650,000 euro to UNRWA to provide aid to alleviate humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Furthermore, we also announced an additional contribution of 150,000 euro to Gaza via World Program. I would just like to finish by saying that the only way to avoid future conflicts and prevent needless human suffering is to resume peace talks with the aim to implement the two-state solution. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask the representative of Greece to please take the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like also to thank the briefers on the situation in Gaza for this meeting today. In the interest of time, I will be brief. I would like to, first of all, recognize the courageous work and sacrifice of UN employees in Gaza, and in particular those, including the more than 70 UNRWA staff who have paid the ultimate price in their line of duty. I would also like to extend our sincere condolences to all those who have suffered or lost loved ones. The gravity of the situation in the Middle East is of great concern. This serious crisis presents a huge challenge and a test to all of us. We are particularly alarmed by the catastrophic humanitarian crisis unfolding today in Gaza. We are stepping up our efforts together with our partners to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to those in need. In this respect, we would like to announce that an aircraft C-130 has already been scheduled to be dispatched to El Arish Airport in Egypt with pharmaceuticals as well as medical equipment as a first in-kind response of humanitarian assistance from Greece. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the representative of Switzerland to take the floor.
Thank you very much, and I thank OCHA for this important briefing and for your absolutely crucial work on the ground in devastating circumstances. Switzerland is deeply concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, and we recall all parties that the civilian population must be protected at all times and that international humanitarian law must be respected. We have spared no effort in the past weeks to reach a consensus in the Security Council over measures allowing full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access throughout the Gaza Strip consistent with international humanitarian law. We also just announced the first initial rapid response envelope to the ICRC and to the OCHA-led Humanitarian Fund for the OPT. In addition, the Federal Council has proposed the allocation of an additional 90 million Swiss francs to the crisis, which we hope will be swiftly approved by Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. China appreciates USG and other speakers for their speaking and is deeply concerned about the severe humanitarian situation in Palestine, especially in Gaza, as the escalation of conflicts causes massive civilian casualties and humanitarian disasters. China calls for stopping the fight as soon as possible, firmly opposes harming civilians, advocates that the safety of humanitarian medical workers must be guaranteed, and appreciates the efforts of Egypt and other regional countries and the Secretary General and other UN agency representatives in opening humanitarian corridors. We believe that the international community must act urgently, make preventing a greater humanitarian catastrophe the top priority among all ongoing efforts, quickly open up humanitarian corridors, ensure humanitarian access, and bring the hope of life to the Palestinian people, especially the people of Gaza. In order to contribute to the humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza, the Chinese government has recently provided $1 million in cash assistance to the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA. On top of that, China will provide another 15 million RMB worth of humanitarian supplies, including food and medicines, to the Gaza region, and related projects are being implemented with the aim of helping the people of Gaza and to get through this conflict and hope for an early resolution of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with apologies to Representative of Denmark, I'd like to give the floor to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Undersecretary Griffith, thank you all briefers. In the interest of time, 3 points. First and foremost, we express our gratitude to all humanitarian staff in Gaza for their tireless work under extremely difficult circumstances. Humanitarian workers must never be a target, and I convey our deepest condolences to colleagues and families who have lost their loved ones. Second point, we echo others, also so many here today, and call for rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach all those in need throughout Gaza and through all necessary measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses. Protection of civilians is not only vital, but one of the core obligations for all parties to a conflict under international humanitarian law. And finally, Denmark has so far announced an extraordinary humanitarian contribution of 50 million Danish kroner, which is approximately $7.1 million US, and this is in addition to the $16.5 million US that Denmark has provided in humanitarian support to the Palestinian situation this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the representative of the United Arab Emirates, followed by Japan. United Arab Emirates, floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, Lynn, and Thomas, for your briefing. I would like to join others in expressing our condolences to the families and loved ones of your colleagues who have been killed in Gaza. The UAE underlines that the international humanitarian law must be fully adhered to and that civilians must be protected in all situations. We echo the calls that we have heard from UN leadership for a full ceasefire, a halt to the indiscriminate area bombardment, the release of all hostages, ensuring the protection of civilians, and enabling safe, sustained humanitarian access at scale. And we heard a similar call loud and clear from 121 member states in the General Assembly last week. We have seen strikes on hospitals, refugee camps, schools, and UN facilities. Protected sites are not protected, and there is nowhere safe for civilians. Gaza has been cut off from electricity, water, food, fuel, the necessities of life. More than 2 million people, roughly half of them children, are being subjected to the most inhumane treatment. The situation in Gaza demands our action. We appreciate the UN's tireless efforts at all levels to advocate for the protection of civilians and humanitarian access. The amount of aid entering Gaza must increase and include the fuel necessary to power hospitals and systems. The UAE is committed to doing all it can to improve the situation of all civilians who are suffering right now. We launched an air bridge to Egypt that has transported more than 200 tons of aid from the UN and UAE aid, and we have offered medical treatment and care for 1,000 children wounded in Gaza in the UAE in coordination with ICRC. We also announced an additional $20 million to UNRWA, raising our support to $55 million this year. Before I close, I would also like to restate our grave concern about the ongoing violence against Palestinians in the West Bank that has led to more than 128 deaths, 25 of them children, and 2,000 injuries. This is unacceptable. We reiterate once again that civilians must be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Representative Japan.
Thank you. Thank you for this very important briefing by OCHA this morning. Japan would also like to extend our deepest condolences to the families of the victims and for the loss of at least 72 UN staff and personnel. Japan is very deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and also we fully support the immediate humanitarian pauses and the establishment of humanitarian corridors to ensure that humanitarian assistance can be provided. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access consistent with international humanitarian law must be allowed. Japan has already committed $10 million aid package, and then also we are currently working to provide $65 million in additional aid. Japan once again unequivocally condemns Hamas' brutal attack on Israel and its taking of hostages. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. In conclusion, the international community needs to work together to restore hope and pave the path for peace and security in both Palestine and Israel. We must all act to de-escalate the situation with a sense of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Representative Israel.
Under Secretary General, Excellencies, on October 7, the Hamas terror organization mounted an unprecedented terror attack against the citizens of Israel. A rampage of murder, torture, rape, mutilation, and kidnapping, trampling on every basic principle of law and humanity, with more than 1,400 murdered and over 240 abducted to Gaza and held hostage. With this barbaric terror attack, Hamas initiated a war against Israel. Hamas exploits the civilians of Gaza, preventing temporary civilian evacuation from combat zones, seizing humanitarian aid, and firing rockets indiscriminately from within dense urban areas. Hamas, as a strategy, embeds armaments and terrorist cells within, next to, and underneath hospitals, as well as schools, mosques, UN facilities, and other concentrations of non-combatants. This practice constitutes war crime. Israel attempts to mitigate and prevent harm to civilians in Gaza. The IDF has encouraged residents in the north to evacuate temporarily to the south. The humanitarian assistance has broadened significantly, including food, water, and medicine. Hamas stockpiled approximately 500,000 liters of fuel, and now they create pressure in the international discourse and a public image of fuel shortage. Yet somehow there is enough to fire rockets. Any claims regarding fuel shortages should be addressed to Hamas. We ask you to address the situation without repeating the lies of Hamas. The humanitarian crisis we should be focusing on is the 240 hostages. These are innocent people, including elderly women and children, taken forcefully by Hamas, ripped from the arms of their loved ones. Their Hamas captors have historically and presently shown zero regard for the Geneva Convention. Everyone sitting in this room should be demanding from Hamas to immediately and unequivocally return all hostages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the final two interventions to ICRC and Save the Children, and would ask understanding from agency colleagues and apologies that we won't be able to hear those remarks given we've already gone 40 minutes over. We will then return back to Lynn Hastings and the podium here for a very 1-minute closing remarks. So thank you for your understanding. So with that, could I please ask the representative of ICRC to take the floor?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin, for your recount, Lynn and Tom, for sharing those elements that we absolutely share with regards to the situation in Gaza. Our president said it recently, there's a catastrophic failing that the world must not tolerate. And this is really a call that a lot gather behind, and I believe this is an important element to continue pushing for elements. Everyone talks about international humanitarian law. It is commendable that everyone is understanding the same thing as regards to its pertinence. Now it's the moment to operationalize it, to make it a reality for the people that need to be protected, for the humanitarians that need to work and respond right now to the Ukrainian needs, for the release of the hostages that needs to happen right now, for the people that are detained that need to be accessed, and for the safety to be ensured right now to the best of our capacity and abilities. Some people said it already, we need to connect with the overall environment. The humanitarians cannot replace commodities that will be, that were previously supported and provided by many actors beside the humanitarians. And while the movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescents is working tirelessly, the Federation first and foremost, but all the national society in Egypt, Palestine obviously, and Magen David Adom, they're all working to try to respond to all the needs. We can't just do it by ourselves, and we will need to connect immediately with a system that needs to cope with the immensity of the requirements that we are facing. I will just pass a last message. Those obligations under international humanitarian law, we all agree those are moral imperatives, legal obligation, life-saving necessities. None of them are to be transactionable, to be a transaction one against another. Those need to happen right now. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Save the Children, please, Representative.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, we are all witnessing the violence in Gaza and Israel, which is deeply distressing. And it's our shared responsibility to address this humanitarian catastrophe. The number of children killed in just 3 weeks has exceeded the total number of annual child casualties recorded in the HD's CAC report since 2019. More than 3,700 children have been killed in Gaza, 33 in West Bank and 29 in Israel. In conscious of time, I will just talk about what Save the Children calls for. We urge all conflicted parties to agree on a humanitarian ceasefire. During this ceasefire, we call on all parties to unconditionally facilitate the delivery of life-saving assistance, including food, medical supplies, fuel, electricity, and undisrupted internet connection to Gaza, in addition to safe passages of humanitarian and medical staff. Second, free all civilian hostages, especially children and elderly. Third, allow humanitarian convoys to reach UN facilities, schools, hospitals, and health facilities in northern Gaza and commit to protecting them along with the civilians and staff inside them at all times. Fourth, rescind orders by the government of Israel for civilians to depart northern Gaza. Fifth, allow patients in critical condition to be medically evacuated for urgent care. Children are not bargaining chips. Families need a chance to bury and mourn their dead. The cycle of violence against innocent civilians and children particularly needs to stop and needs to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, apologies for needing to close the floor for interventions now so that we can have the final words from our colleagues at the podium. And first, I'd like to give the floor to Lynn Hastings. Over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Lisa. Really, what more can be said? Of course, a release of the hostages immediately and unconditionally, a humanitarian ceasefire, and also delivery of assistance throughout Gaza, also unconditionally. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Sorry, did you just close? I couldn't. Yes? Okay. Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for joining us. Tom had to close and go do the important work that he's been doing, so I want to give the floor to Greta Gunnarsdottir, the representative here for UNRWA in New York.
Please, thank you. so much, and I just want to thank OCHA and USG Griffith for inviting us to this meeting, and I would like to thank Tom also for taking out time because he has a lot of other things to do, but this audience here is also extremely important for UNRWA, and I would like to thank all of you for the expression of sympathy for the loss of our staff and also for the support to the agency. I just want to underline, I think we have all speaking more or less the same language here today. We call it different, we name it different names, but we have been calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. We are calling for humanitarian access into the territory and throughout the territory, and respect for international humanitarian law by all the parties to this conflict. And if we reflect on the loss of lives since the 7th of October, and what you heard Tom talk about, that now in Gaza it has boiled down to people asking for food and water. The Commissioner General comes there for a visit, and people are not interested in really discussing. They need food and water. That is what we have, that is what the situation is today. So I just want to put out to this room that we do not have much time. I think we really need to reflect on that. We do not have much time. There is an urgency here for an action by the international community, and we stand ready, UNRWA, we stand ready on the ground to do our bit if the rest of the membership does what is needed to make it possible for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and again, thank you for your colleagues' dedication to assisting the people on the ground. Now I'd like to give the final word to Martin Griffiths.
Thank you very much. Real apologies to the agencies, and thank you very much for being kind enough to desist, because I know you have a lot to say, and thank you very much indeed. It's been a very full meeting, as I think we could all at least agree on that. I want to say three things very quickly. One, to confirm Lynn's points. Lynn's points are very simple. Silence the guns, get aid in. Let's stop this and move on. And I support that completely. And I'm very glad that Lynn has put it so succinctly, as she always does. Secondly, I wanted to say to Georgia about Tom. I think it's unfair to accuse Tom of not wanting a ceasefire. He said it daily in his life there. He has said it all the time. But he was also, in that case, speaking about as you said, the immediate needs as expressed by the people he was meeting. And then finally, UNRWA. UNRWA is an organization which goes broke every year. We know that because we always have to lend UNRWA money to get it through the last parts of the year. Let us hope at least this, because we have found out so clearly the absolutely vital importance of UNRWA, its role in the West Bank, and I'm glad people mentioned the West Bank, as well as in Gaza. Its role is of a fundamental, essential, core humanitarian need. Thank you to all those today who have pledged more money for UNRWA. And thank you to UNRWA for being UNRWA. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for your participation, and this closes the Member States briefing. Thank you.